move it to on the screen. Great. Ready? Hello everyone, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Luke Nicol to the RNCM. Luke is one of the country's, well, the world's foremost composers of experimental music, a conceptual artist. He is based in Bristol as an independent researcher and composer, but is also a graduate of the University of Bath Spa, and originally from Canada. We've just had an amazing session hearing about a whole plethora of early works that include procedural pieces, pieces around typing, and pieces that foreground oral communication in music as part of their conceptual basis. We're excited to hear about recent work, including music played at the RNCM just in the last month, I think, by Zubin Kanga. So please welcome Luke.
Hi everybody, thanks for the introduction. So my presentation today is called Tracks, Scores, and Paths, Intersections Between Roller Coasters, Music, and Artificial Intelligence. What are some shared concepts between music and roller coasters? Something that was really important to me in going down this road or going on this track was how can I avoid mapping? So I really think about my previous supervisor, James Saunders, who wrote an article called No Mapping, which was against the idea of mapping being something that takes something from one domain, sort of smashes it into another domain, and then erases the source. So you might have like a piece about weather patterns where you don't really, it's like, of course, it could be about anything. They just make patterns for the piece and it's not really reflexive. And I wanted to kind of avoid this like smash into one and use an idea more of translation. So something that still shows the original form. So something that both has the translated concept and still shows something about the original, and to move past that and to sort of have some resonance in both areas. So not only, in my case, would the roller coasters that I'm designing affect the music, but I want the music to affect the roller coasters as well, to sort of create this resonance space between the two concepts. And finally, kind of emergent interest for me, how can AI be incorporated into my workflow in ways that feel meaningful and collaborative, which I'll talk about, I think, more at the end. So a little bit about my background. As was said in the introduction, I'm a UK-based Canadian composer, roller coaster designer, and researcher. Before I became interested in music, I started designing roller coasters, and that was maybe when I was about 12 or 13. I was really geeky. I was really into roller coasters. I was like researching them, memorizing stats, building them. I started in like Roller Coaster Tycoon, so the most basic hobby software, and then I moved into super geeky CAD-based simulation software, which I'll talk about in relation to my current practice. So I was doing all that before I got into really composing music. But it formed a really important route actually into making music in the early days, which was that I was on these online forums learning to kind of communicate with other people, model things, test things out, post them, and I kind of jumped from roller coasters into music by jumping forums from roller coasters to video game music. In any case, 20 years later, I noticed that the software that I was using when I was younger released a new version, which is very unusual. It was like there's a huge gap, and then suddenly there's a new version of the software, and I thought, this is maybe a sign. Maybe I should check that out and see if I'm still interested in roller coasters in some way. And it turns out, as you'll see, I think, that I'm still very interested in roller coasters, and I think that roller coasters and music have a lot in common, and they're kind of interesting when they butt up against each other a little bit. And then recently, during the pandemic, I became interested in AI art creation. And this was because there wasn't really any real collaborators that I could have other than people on Zoom, but I wasn't working with musicians in person or working with a collaborator, so I had to find new ways of making things, and a lot of these ways involved electronic music and AI. So we got there. I always think it's nice to start out with a little bit of context of how roller coasters appear in art today. And so I think the most obvious iterations of roller coaster in art are actually in VR or like theme park experiences, but I was sort of interested in tracing more of a path through fine art, so mixed media and sculpture. So I'll go through just quickly some examples. So here you have the Euthanasia coaster by Juliet Fraser. And this is a roller coaster conceptual idea that's designed to kill you as it gets through the track. This made a huge splash online because people thought it was real. He really made plans for it. He made like all kinds of documents. There's a faux documentary. It was like a full conceptual space of an idea. Similarly, oh yeah, so this is a roller coaster tycoon art piece, which is like the longest, most boring roller coaster possible in Roller Coaster Tycoon. And this artist on YouTube has made a bunch of these similar kind of conceptual rides that sort of bend the program. Here we have the Centrifuge Brain Project, which is a sort of faux documentary about cognition-altering monster theme park rides. You can see here these Ferris wheels sort of extend into eternity. And I've noticed that this has actually been picked up as like a faux news piece by lots of garbage news outlets. So clearly worked well. It was a good faux documentary about this terrifying theme park. Here we have Soul Soaker by, I believe, Canadian artist Kristen Lucas. And this was more of like a VR experience where you walk on this path, this boardwalk that becomes a roller coaster through different sites of sculpture and memory. And most recently, Universe by Jebak, I think is the pronunciation. And this was at 180 The Strand recently. And it's all these kind of fairground rides that are abstracted and put into this dark setting, which aren't really roller coasters, but I thought kind of resonated with the concept of it. Then we have some sculptures, which are much more obvious. And this is the most recent one, which I think was displayed in Oxford. And I think this one really shows me, so this is by Jesse Darling. This really shows me something about roller coasters that I'm super interested in, which is like, when you see this twisted form that crashes and breaks, like we imagine ourselves, we imagine a car traveling this and we imagine ourselves on this car. So there's something that happens with roller coasters where we put ourselves in the position. And I've definitely had the response, like, I love roller coasters, so my work with roller coasters, like it fills me with joy because that's what I feel about roller coasters. But friends who hate roller coasters, who are terrified of them, look at my work and are like, this is terrifying. So we'll see what you think when you see the videos of my work. I just wanted to share a little bit about the program that I use to make roller coasters before going into the work that I do. So I use No Limits Coaster 2. It's a hobby software, and there's two basic modes. There's an editor and a simulator. You can see what both look like. So this is the editor. You manipulate splines, you move them around. This is it's a little small, but yeah, you can see you sort of make a spline-based track, you move it around, you can make supports, and you can do other things like import 3D objects. You can actually import data to make the track spline, which means that you can actually generate it in a program outside of this program, or algorithmically. You can export the track spline, so you can put it into a 3D program if you wanted to. You can do some proprietary coding, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Oh, that image is missing. How interesting. Okay, well, you'll see this later. So the simulator mode is where the program renders it all into 3D. You can ride the roller coaster, and you can also capture it on video. And you'll see that in my pieces, so forgive me that that's not present. So I'm going to walk through a few of the early roller coaster pieces that I made before jumping into the two more in-depth ones that I'll talk about in this presentation. And in each of these, I'm going to play a little video as well, just to show you what I was doing. Right, so first we have Moon River 32. This was my first roller coaster and music piece, and I was working with a pretty basic idea here, which was just to use the simulated roller coasters as an accompaniment to live music. So I basically like made the roller coasters, captured them as video, edited the video, and put it alongside live music. So I'm just going to full screen this video if I can. I might actually don't have sound. Oh, keep it running? Okay. Ooh, I went backwards. Okay, it's running again. So each of the pieces that I'm going to play, or each of the excerpts that I'll play, is probably about two minutes max. So just so you know, you're not sitting here for like 10 minutes ever. I'm just going to be playing kind of trailers of things. So that was the first piece. As I say, it was really like the music and the roller coasters existed quite separately. I just wrote some music, made some roller coasters, edited the video together, and put it together in a live performance. There were some sort of resonances in that. You heard I was using Moon River, which was sung by Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. The roller coaster used some elements of Breakfast at Tiffany's, like this window and door and some lighting and things. So it was like I tried to keep them kind of conceptually together, but I wasn't really, I was just starting at that point. The next piece that I'll talk about is called Palace 64. And in this piece, I made the video of the roller coasters in a kind of similar way, but then I had a live ensemble that was actually interpreting the video as a musical score. And they were doing this with a fairly like basic translation of parameters from the track to music. So they were sort of like, okay, the roller coaster goes faster, the pitch goes up a little bit, slower, slows down a little bit, etc. But I was trying to craft something a little bit more narrative in the video and a little bit more like refined here. And this was performed by Decibel Ensemble in Australia at Tenor 2019, so a conference about music, notation, and technology. So I was trying to use this sort of roller coaster, starting to explore this idea of a roller coaster track as a score. Play another short excerpt. So in that piece, in terms of the roller coasters, I was working more with algorithmic generation. So I was using formulas to actually generate the track itself, and trying to kind of like play at creating like a world for these roller coasters where these little cars are kind of like insects pollinating, and the track became sort of like choral features or something. I was trying to aim for something more of like a complete world there. Okay. Okay, so then the third older piece is Impossible Roller Coasters Tutorials 1 to 3. And this was something I made during the pandemic. It was originally supposed to be a live performance for myself, kind of a lecture performance where I was going to talk about making roller coasters, but at the same time as making roller coasters and using them as musical instruments. But the pandemic happened, and I still had this commission for a festival in Hong Kong that was happening in fall of 2020. So I ended up Okay.
If you reshare, it should be okay.
Okay. I will.
Some colleagues will know you've got a slight hardware IT issue at the moment, so this is liable to.
Okay, one sec. One moment. So I'll reshare my screen. There we go. Share. Okay. And okay, one more try here.
Forget everything you know about roller coasters. Forget the idea that roller coasters are made for humans. Enter a creative state where boundaries, intersections, danger, and collisions are productive and empowering goals. Embrace the impossible.
So now I'm going to move on to talking about the two pieces that I want to focus on in this presentation. And these are sort of the two most recent pieces in all of this roller coaster music intersection stuff. And these are kind of where AI starts to also get thrown in the mix. So the first piece is Steel Becomes Silk Gravity Recast. And this was created with Juliet Fraser, who's a soprano based in the UK, in 2021. It was made for the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival as part of their HCMF COVID-19 commissions. So it had, Great, so I'm going to start out by playing the kind of trailer version of the piece, and I think I'll play it at the end of talking about it as well. So hopefully you can play the trailer, I'll talk about a bunch of aspects of the piece, and then we'll watch it again, and maybe you'll see, more of what I talked about at that point.
that presses your cars and throttles them into the air. You shout the hills, the crests, the curves. You scream the gravel, you swear in the hills. You haul the tunnels. You scream the plain. You speak in the language of the tracks, you sing in the language of the speed. You strike the wall. You break the track. You scream the figure eight, you scream the straightaway, you scream the noise, you scream the riders. You roar and you scream and you scream and you scream. You never run out of breath.
You scream until you amaze, and then you cry, and then you, the roller coaster, you, give your life to this world, to the hills. The flume.
So some of the goals that I had before making this piece were to turn the roller coaster simulator that I was using into a tool for live performance in terms of visuals and sound. So previous to that, all the pieces were I did everything beforehand, cut the video, synced it, and then played it during the performance. And this time I really wanted to be inside this editor simulator environment live on stage. So that meant putting myself on stage for one, but also the challenge that this program that I'm using, No Limits Coaster, has two modes. It has editor and simulator, and you can't really, you have to like load in between the two. You can't change anything live in the simulator. It's like a really rendered environment. So this presented a challenge when I was working with the idea of this in live performance, because it meant that I couldn't just like move things around in the simulator while also riding the roller coaster and having sound and stuff. I had to be like in this editor mode or in this simulator mode. A goal was also to collaborate with Juliet online during the pandemic, because that's when this started, in ways that felt meaningful and then embraced slowness and gentle development. So this was like, I didn't want it to be stressful. I didn't want us to really feel like super pressured to make something that was like, it had to feel kind of, it had to match the moment we were in, which was this pandemic moment of like, right, we need to be gentle and slow to ourselves. So something that felt open and generative that way. And finally, to explore DIY AI tools for generating text, sound, and visuals. And I guess I mean DIY in the sense that like, I'm not associated with an institution. I don't have a huge computing lab behind me. I'm using tools that I can access either on my computer, using my own video card, which is not very good, or through Google Colab. So it's like things that I can access and use at home, even though they sometimes take a bit of work to figure out. So these were the goals. Right, so a little bit about then the way that we built the piece, Juliet and I. So we had a collaborative working method beforehand, and one of the ways that we generated material was using this process of living score making that I use in kind of the rest of my practice when I'm not making roller coaster stuff, which is that I record myself speaking instructions, which are kind of musical sometimes or conceptual, and then I send them to a performer who listens to them once, deletes them, and then they become this sort of living instruction or living score that they remember and I remember, and it kind of exists only in that space. And in this case, what that took the form of was a series of guided roller coaster meditations. So I was sending Juliet sound files that were sort of like, imagine building a roller coaster in your mind, like this monster roller coaster that does all these things. And she was getting these transmissions and building these roller coasters in her mind and gradually memorizing them into like very codified things that existed. And then she could essentially ride those in her mind, because she's amazing, and translate, similar to the other piece, translate the parameters of the roller coaster into music, so into things like pitch and rhythm and timbre. At the same time, I was creating soundscapes using roller coaster sound effects, which you heard in kind of the first section of that, which then I had Juliet listen to and imitate, and I kind of built up layers of that and then put her imitations back into the main mix of the electronics. And when I was doing that, I was kind of imagining myself doing drag in a way, because I don't really make like gestural, electronic, electroacoustic-y music. And I kind of saw it as a fun moment that I could like drag it up and just pretend I was like this pseudo-Erkam kind of composer, but using all roller coaster sound effects. So I had to make it fun for myself in a way. And in the final section of the piece, then I took Juliet singing and I attached those vocal samples to the roller coaster cars in the simulator and had them affected by things like speed and position, which you saw in kind of the last part of the video where it said like singer and video game duetting at last, or whatever it says there. And you sort of see the cars with Juliet's choiry voice, or like, you know, the pitches going up or down as they go. I made a little diagram here, which is kind of big enough to see, but I'll explain it. It's a little bit just about how I see the transformation that occurs through the piece. So we have this image of a roller coaster and the sound here, which then I sent to Juliet, and she recorded her imitation. In the first, so that was all pre-composition. In the first part of the piece, the roller coaster sounds happen, and Juliet's recorded imitation of the roller coaster sounds happen. And on stage, Juliet here has a very tiny roller coaster inside of her mind that she's singing. In the second section, which is the part that you saw with the AI avatar and the text that was being read, that sort of conceptual idea of turning the audience into a roller coaster or transforming them into a roller coaster. And this was an idea that I think largely the AI that I guided into writing the text provided for me. And it became sort of a witchy spell that transformed the audience from human to roller coaster via, it's not really apparent in the text there, but it's sort of like eroticism and ritual sacrifice. So it's kind of dark by the end. It's like you're sacrificing yourself and only the roller coaster exists inside of you, and it's very bizarre. So then the final section of the piece, after that transformation occurs, you see in the diagram here, Juliet's now inside of the roller coaster, so her sounds become the roller coaster sounds, and she's, well, this final part of the diagram isn't totally true, because in the performance, she was kind of like imitating what's happening on screen, but this diagram represents what's going to happen in the future, which is that Juliet's going to sing through a live style transfer when I get Rave set up on my computer by Antoine Caillon, and she's going to sing through a trained roller coaster model of sound effects, and it will come out, her singing will come out sounding like roller coaster sound effects. So the piece sees all these sort of transformations of like roller coaster sound to Juliet, Juliet's sounds into roller coasters, her sound directly into roller coasters. You see all these sort of transformations happening. A little bit about then the AI in the piece. So this was pretty early days for me in AI, which I think you can probably see in the visuals there. One of the things about developing any kind of visuals with AI is they change. It's like the tools change every 2 weeks. So it's like something that I made now 9 months ago already feels pretty dated, but I think it's just a representation of where things were at the time. So the text in that middle section, this roller coaster spell, I used a paragraph of text that I had written, and that was part of Juliet's roller coaster meditations. And then I had access to GPT-2 at the time, which is already a year and a half ago. Now you can obviously access totally different tools. And in making this text, I was guided by Kealata McDowell's interdependence interview that he did with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, where he was talking about a book that he co-wrote with an AI. And what I really took away from it were the idea of not revising text that's generated using an AI. So it's like kind of respecting a text that's been written rather than like editing it and sort of like replacing things and treating, in this case, they really treat the AI as a collaborator, which I'll talk a bit about later, but I found it really interesting in this case to follow a similar methodology. So when I was generating the text, basically, I would use my paragraph, generate something. If I didn't like it, I would just delete that, regenerate. So it's kind of using like tree branching structure, where you generate things, and sometimes you generate something and put in a new line, and then that directs it into a different direction. But you never like go back after it's written things and sort of tweak words and finesse phrases. It's like all about cutting off and truncating and regenerating, which I thought was a pretty generative, it was sort of a generative process for me. I don't, as I say later, I'm not sure I know I don't believe that AI is like an entity of some kind that I need to necessarily respect, but as an experiment, it actually was a really useful tool in having some guidelines for making a text. In terms of the images, these were really like my first attempts at using AI to generate images. So it was my first exploration through notebooks, and I eventually settled on the Pity notebook by Sports Racer 86, which I think was really great at the time. It was the first notebook that allowed for video interpolation, video animation, sort of pixel art look. And it kind of took a while to get my head around, but you'll see some examples. And sound for the piece, which I'll play an example of, I used a bit of AI for the sound, just using Jukebox to generate a pop song using the lyrics that the AI and I had collaboratively written. So I'll show you some examples of this stuff. So here's some of the early explorations. You can see I was like trying to almost get the look of the simulator that I was using by using prompts that included like no limits too. But what I settled on was, for the final bit of the piece, this sort of pixel art kind of situation, which because the song that I generated for the AI, or using the AI, was like really vintagey, I actually liked that it called back to Rollercoaster Tycoon somehow with this pixel art look. And I'll just play you, this is where all the AI image and sound in this piece comes to a head, which is the final bit of the piece.
You're out of cuddles, you stream the plane we did the sack, you speak in the language, you say in the language of speech, the language of speech, you strike the wall, you break the check of money, you read the beat, you scream the noise, you scream the lightness, you go and you scream it, you scream the scream, scream it, scream it, you scream the scream,
pretty nice pop song actually. And that was created using a little fragment of my own music and then generating stuff that came after it using the lyrics from text from other parts of the piece. And I wish I could share with you what the prompts for Jukebox were for that. I forget which artist and style I chose. It was probably like, I think it was like Frank Sinatra with like dreamy Eric Satie or something really, I don't know, it's trying to confuse it a little bit. But you kind of get that Frank Sinatra vocal, I guess. Okay, I think, let's see, I've got, what time it is? Let's see what time it is. Oh yeah, great. I'm going to play this trailer for the whole piece once again now that I've talked about it, and yeah, let's watch this.
That presses your cars and throttles them into the air. You shout the hills, the crests, the curves. You scream the gravel, you swear in the hills. You haul the tunnels. You scream the plain. You speak in the language of the tracks, you sing in the language of the speed. You strike the wall. You break the track. You scream the figure eight, you scream the straightaway, you scream the noise, you scream the riders. You roar and you scream and you scream and you scream. You never run out of breath.
You scream until you amaze, and then you cry, and you cry, and then you, the roller coaster, you, give your life to this world, to the hills. The flume.
Right, and there's two pictures of the live performance. On the left is Juliet and I kind of went all out for this piece, so I made these latex tabard skirts for us to wear. I don't know if you can see that from the way. Yeah, so I made these kind of latex tabard skirts with these roller coastery appliques on them. I don't know, just really wanted to, I sort of felt like if I was going to be on stage, it had to be kind of Bjorky levels of like, I'm really going to commit to being on stage with a costume, and yeah. Yeah, so here's, going back to this idea at the beginning of like, ideas resonating between roller coasters and music. Here, I was thinking about the tracks as musical scores and instruments, but instead of mapping them directly, I was trying to use all the aspects of roller coaster riding. So Juliet was really, in her mind, thinking about the texture of sensation and affect, imagination, the forces at play, and these were affecting the musical parameters. And at the same time, I was reacting to her and actually moving roller coaster bits around and designing. So I was trying to get some of this resonant, reflexive kind of relationship. And I see this actually as really related to Jenny Walsh's piece title is something about ODing on pills, but it's a piece where the performer learns to skateboard, and the instructions of the piece, they really have to go into learning to skateboard, and they build this path of a skateboard in their mind, how it goes, and then they perform an instrumental performance of this skateboard path. And there was something there that really tied together with me, both like Juliet and I are really passionate about actually riding roller coasters, which we've done together, but also then bringing all of these aspects of like physical sensation, paths, movement into performance. Some kind of resonance there. Okay, so then to move on to the most recent piece, this is Hidden Vortices. And this was created for Zubin Kanga in 2021-22, so most recently, which was performed here at the RNCM 2 months ago. As part of the Cyborg Soulless project, and this was a partnership with Soundbrenner, which is a company that makes these tiny vibrating metronome watches. So, but yeah, I'll play a trailer right to start out again. Again, we'll chat after I talk about the piece. Sorry, the videos are a little choppy when I play them on the YouTube, my laptop. So yeah, in this piece I had some maybe more definite research questions, whereas Juliet's piece, there was sort of more of an exploratory freeform thing. Here I was really had a set idea, which was how can I link simulated roller coaster speed to haptic feedback watches to cue musical performance? And what effect is this going to have on the music? And what will this necessitate in terms of new scoring technologies? Secondly, now that I sort of dipped my toes into the water of AI, how can I develop a sophisticated visual language that uses simulated roller coasters and artificial intelligence in my workflow? So first, the basic concept of the piece, which are simulated roller coasters here. The speed becomes a tempo curve that gets into the Soundbrenner watch, which cues Zubin to play the piano. So the simple idea of like roller coaster speed becomes a tempo pulsation, which is pulsing in Zubin's wrist and cueing him to play. So that was sort of the basic, and I kind of knew that idea as soon as Zubin sent me a list of like, oh, you could collaborate with these people or these people, and I saw the Soundbrenner watches and I thought, simple idea, roller coaster speed, watch speed, playing. So in terms of how that happens, I was really lucky with Soundbrenner. They helped design a Python script and sort of a really basic shell max MSP patch that transforms simulated roller coaster speed data from the limits into metronome pulses to be received by the Soundbrenner watches. And what I was really interested in here was the idea that, of course, I could do one roller coaster and send Zubin pulses and he could play something. But what I wanted to do is send him 2 different roller coaster speeds, so one in each hand, and have him play on these variable speed curves. And it sounds absolutely impossible, but I knew that Zubin could do it. So I wanted to see how that would work with these 2 different changing fluctuations of tempo, one in each wrist. And in this case then, actually, thinking about tempo really informed how I had to build the roller coasters, because essentially building the roller coasters built the backbone of how the tempo is going to go through the whole piece or all the events. So I had to be really reflexively thinking about the music while I was building the roller coasters. And in this way, the roller coasters actually became kind of a score building thing. Like they were really the infrastructure of the piece. I've got a little video here that shows Soundbrenner. This is Julian from Soundbrenner. This is like when he cracked the code for how to link up
here's a little update about our roller coaster idea. So as you can see, we got the no limits to run, and it spits out telemetry data, and we're picking it up with a Python script and then sending it to MaxMSP, and from there we can send it to the iOS app, and the iOS app can then send it to the core. And so this is running right now. It's actually vibrating exactly like this this little object here in Max. So this receives OSC from our script, which is getting the data from the game, and here we are mapping it between some minimum and maximum values. Here right now this is the speed value from the roller coaster, and it's mapping it to 40 to 300 BPM, and then we're running a metronome here and sending out a MIDI message directly to the phone. So you can see it.
So I wish I could explain how this was like this was the most amazing thing that I could have ever received in my inbox the day that it came. So like from the beginning of working with roller coasters, I was really imagining this like, okay, someday I'm gonna get the roller coaster data out into MaxMSP, and then I can do anything with it. But I couldn't quite do it myself, and I didn't really know who to ask at the time. And it just happened that in this project, Julian at Soundbrenner was both a music tech nerd and like an actual tech nerd. So he had used MaxMSP, and he knew his technology of Soundbrenner, and he was willing to go a little bit into my game that I use and build this link up for me. So this really opened up, like, it's such a world of possibilities, because now I can of course use MaxMSP to interpret this roller coaster data to do kind of anything that I want. So explain a little bit about
here's a little update.
So another essentially kind of small diagram, but I'll just talk through it. So in this case, in the pre-composition stage, the roller coaster in this case is representing the roller coaster speed. And as you saw there, it goes into MaxMSP. And then it goes into, in the pre-composition, 3 different places. The speed data becomes audio. So I use the speed data, the tapping metronome pulses, to actually generate audio. So it generates all these sorts of different instruments and pulses. It also becomes a MIDI file. So that's most important, is that in the piece, I'm not actually running the roller coaster simulator live. I captured everything into a MIDI file, so that's very stable. I don't have to have this like weird non-musical simulator open during performance. It's just like a MIDI file that I can put into any other program. And then also all the pulses I recorded as events in time. So it's like the whole piece exists as a list of events in time. Each of these pulses, these roller coaster curves of tempo, becomes just a point in time. And that became a spreadsheet, and eventually became a score using a graphing program called R, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then of course, I also recorded the video out of the roller coaster simulator, which I spit through some AI, but I'll talk about that later as well. The important thing here is the video is captured at the same time as the metronome speed data going out became metronome data. So it's like you always have this video that has an associated MIDI file with it of like a click track that's changing speed at the same time as the roller coaster. So in the performance then, that MIDI file, which is the roller coaster speeds times 2, gets put into QLab. The audio and the video file gets put into QLab. And then the MIDI gets sent out to the 2 watches that Zubin's wearing, and those cue him to play. The audio and video get sent out to these audio video. And then also the MIDI file gets sent to MaxMSP and sent to some strobe lights, which you may have seen a little bit in the final section of the piece there on the video. So I wanted not only to interpret the roller coaster speed as cues for Zubin, but I really wanted the audience to see it and feel it as well. So it becomes like sub-bass pulses and strobe lights and like lots of sound. So I wanted to be kind of seen and felt as well as just cueing Zubin. The little thing on the side here, it's not super large, but basically I was also thinking about the watches and their role. So in the first section of the piece, the watches are both in the piano and on Zubin's wrist. So you hear them as kind of a prepared piano, like vibrating the piano at the same time as Zubin's playing the notes. In the second section, he's just wearing them. And in the final section of the piece, the watches all go inside the piano and are all vibrating as instruments that are resonating and making the piano into this kind of instrument that's all being played by the roller coaster speeds. So the score for the piece, I originally was hoping for this situation to be Zubin like having these pulses on his hands and just playing like a total, like a total hero basically. But it became really clear in the workshops that unless he was going to play really, really basic musical material, like even something simple like a chromatic scale where one hand was changing tempo at a different rate as the other was very, very difficult. And in fact, it would really help him to see what was coming up ahead in the piece, which, go figure, a musician wants to see what's coming up. They don't want to be surprised, and I totally understand that. So I needed to find a way of representing what was coming up in the piece to Zubin in a way that didn't feel like I was compromising this main premise of Zubin being cued by the haptic feedback from the roller coasters. So ultimately, I tried some different graphs, which I'll show you. So I tried using like color, temperature to show, okay, upcoming, the roller coaster speed is getting faster and then it's slowing down, darker, lighter blue and stuff. But it kind of, in the end, it was like, I actually need musical notation here because I want Zubin to play specific pitches. So somewhere he's gonna have to see specific pitches, and therefore those specific pitches should also probably be where they are on a staff, and therefore they need to appear kind of where they are in rhythm. So I ended up with needing a graphed spatial notation. And I was really lucky that I had a scientist friend of mine who uses a programming environment called R, which is a data visualization programming environment. And he was like, oh yeah, we'll just make R into a musical notation software for you. Because if you can imagine trying to notate 15 minutes of extremely precise spatially notated events, it's just like, it's not possible in Sibelius, which I normally use. Like you can't, everything's moving around, it's all like changing proportions, like you can't, and if I were to try to do it in like Illustrator or InDesign, it would have just taken ages measuring out each thing with each sort of event. So what I wanted was something that I could like have a spreadsheet and spit out the score, which it wasn't quite that simple, but I'll show you how I get there. So these are kind of the early versions, which were like, as I was talking about, just like a basic tempo, temperature raster plot. So you can see in the second one, it's the most clear. So the black lines are the events. So these are the roller coaster curves turned into single events. And then you see the broader sense of like when the blue gets lighter, it's sort of showing that that there's more events or less events per second. But I think like ultimately that requires the performer to then like really learn to interpret this color graph. And it's like, because there were also, I had the problem that there were also specific notes that each of these black bars needed to represent. It was like, I just needed musical notation, which clearly I tried everything not to use, but I had to do it in the end. So this is what the notation ended up looking like for a few different sections. So the top one is just a single hand thing, but you can see it's all very precisely, the red dotted lines are seconds, and the note heads, each time one is occurring, Zubin's getting a vibration in his wrist, and he's also playing it on the piano. But he can see what's upcoming, so he can kind of predict and then play very accurately. So of course, like with something kind of relatively simple like the first line, he might have been able to play it without, actually without the watch. He could have just maybe played it by looking at the thing. But in the end, we made it so that the audio, because MIDI is sort of sending the pulses to him in the watches, I was also using MIDI to trigger all sorts of other audio things. So it actually meant that he could have played it with other watches, but then he wouldn't have been perfectly in sync with the rest of the piece. And I really wanted to avoid like a live electronic situation. I wanted it all to just be pre-recorded, which meant that this worked really well because he was getting precise things to play, he was playing at precise times, there's precise things happening in the electronics, none of which were being triggered by pedals or by like whatever, other methods of live stuff. In this second one, you see a bit of the two-hand thing. So again, it's just very clear for him where things happen. And then in this final one, that's just showing a bit more of like, I was using the graphing program to do a bit more of an expressive thing and combining it with InDesign to make something that is sort of more piano-y, piano gesture, which you heard in the third bit of the trailer with the sort of Ravel arpeggios. So he's playing these different arpeggios that last different amounts of time that are stretched and compressed differently for each hand. So in terms of the musical material, The musical materials all taken from Ravel's left-hand piano concerto, for the most part, all the piano material. I'll play like a little bit of, the main method was using a Melodyne transcription of the piece and then exporting that as MIDI, which sounds like kind of fun, kind of garbagey all at once. Like this. So this is the beginning of the Ravel left-hand concerto, which is like a bunch of double basses basically sawing away. And then, of course, Melodyne is just picking up all the partials and things, so it just makes it into this weird... So that doesn't exactly sound like what Zubin was playing, but what I did with that was I distilled that down to just a single note at a time, and then essentially the pitch material gets mapped onto those tempo events that we made using the Rollercoaster graphs. And I kind of think of it a bit like a music box that you're sort of churning, speeding up, slowing down, but like all the musical events are sort of set. They occur when they're going to occur. In the second section, I used the Ravel left-hand concerto, the first chord when it enters, which is this open fifth chord. You can hear here, and then I just like work to the ground a bit using Vortexes as well. And also, during the very beginning of making this piece, Sophie passed away, which is one of my favorite electronic musicians. It really affected me. I was really like distraught for a while, and I didn't know what to do. So this piece, kind of, Sophie found her way into it. Somewhat in the electronic music influences, and also somewhat in the AI imagery, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I used the electronic sound ultimately to highlight these tempo changes in other strata. So you have like sub bass that's pulsing as well, hi-hats that are pulsing, and they're not always pulsing at the same time as Zubin is. It's sort of a global picture of these roller coaster kind of tempos. So in terms of the AI for this piece, I was really aiming to like make this a bit more sophisticated, and thankfully the tools were also getting a bit more sophisticated. So I was using the Pity collab notebook again for this one, and the main technique that I was using for the video was that I was using my roller coaster simulator video, and then I was interpolating frames of it using different changing prompts. So I was like saying, for example, I think in this one, I don't know what the prompt would have been, like inside the body or something, and then it was generating images that it thinks of, it's generating images based on a trained data set that represent inside the body, but using my roller coaster simulated images, roller coaster simulated video, each frame as like the initial training image. And the prompt writing was really something that I had to think a lot about here. So in the end, I wanted to weave Sophie into the prompt writing somehow to give this piece sort of a conceptual backbone that was, paying homage or resonating a little bit. And so I used song lyrics from Sophie, but I had to really kind of change them around to make them useful as prompts, because sometimes a prompt you think is going to be really good, so you're like, great, AI, give me a pearl, and then it comes up with like something really like tacky, like, I don't know, it's just like the wrong thing. Or like the one that I really thought it was like oil, so what was it, like oil spill, but it was kept coming with like boats and things that I really didn't want. Like I didn't want these boats and stuff, so I had to really refine each thing. So pearl became like shining oyster pearl, and oil became oil slick on water, because I wanted that black rainbow oil slick on water. And the really helpful thing that I used to do this is called Clip Front, which is a tool that allows you to essentially search this model clip. You type in a prompt and see what kind of images it generates. So it gives you sort of a preview idea of what the model might do without having to like wait the hours and hours and hours that it takes for me on Google Colab to like generate these videos. So I was able to search like Perl and go, okay, the results are not going to be very good. And in doing this, I was able to transform these Sophie lyrics into prompts that then sort of became the backbone of the video. And also, I created a Max MSP patch that basically allowed me to algorithmically change prompts so that I could have some prompts like fading in and out over time. So I was able to have quite a complex relationship of like, okay, oyster pearl is like starting strong but disappearing, and then oil slick is coming out of that, and all these things. And I was able to sort of map that over time, which allowed me to kind of create a more sophisticated video. So in the second section of the piece, I trained a model using scraped roller coaster images from Wikipedia. And then I had a friend, Justin Focus, who helped program me a little Google notebook that allowed my simulated roller coasters to actually navigate the latent space of the model of roller coaster images. And I did this basically by using a tool called Wekinator, which is super useful. It's a really light AI tool, and what it does is you can essentially take inputs and map to outputs of any number. So in my case, my inputs were XYZ, roller coaster position in space, and the outputs were 512 latent space. I'm probably not explaining that right, but it was like 512 dimensions of latent space. So I needed my 3 inputs to somehow go into 512 dimensional inputs. So this Wekinator tool, you kind of train it and then you can output it. So it's like kind of a black box. I don't fully, it's like I understand what it does, but I don't understand how it does it. But it was super useful in that then my roller coaster paths became paths that navigate between different points in the latent space. So I was essentially able to navigate through images of roller coasters using my roller coasters. And there's a little image of how that looks in performance. So you see the roller coasters on screen, but then also these AI generated images of roller coasters. And so the sound in the piece also used some different AI tools. Pardon me. So I recorded Zubin playing the first section of the piece and fed that through Holly Plus, which is Holly Herndon's digital likeness voice model, which is available online. And basically it's like you can put whatever sound in and it'll come out in this sort of really rough Holly Herndon-esque choral sound. And for me, I put in this very simple piano line and got out like a nice, sorry if you're having trouble seeing it, maybe in the way, I'm not sure. Yeah, I put in this kind of nice, very simple piano line and got out kind of a choral line. And then I used single pitches of this Holly Plus piano background and essentially allowed Jukebox to use each single pitch as like a gambit that it would fill in with different bits of Ravel-esque sound. So you get this kind of stitched together, I kind of thought of it as like an AI reverb. So you have a note and then something kind of grows out of it and then it fades away. You have a note and something fades out of it. But all these different kind of Ravel effects. And then because I wanted to do this without like live electronics, I just used this as a backing track. And Zubin plays precisely on cue, and that happens at precise times. Okay, so in this this piece, the concept, I guess in the end, it felt like a giant kind of automata. Like it was like this big puppety robot thing where the roller coaster speed is triggering and managing all these other processes. So you've got like musical events, you have vibrations on Zubin's wrist, his playing, flashing lights, video, and the video forms this kind of draping over the automata of like an ornamental layer. And also, of course, the simulated roller coaster sometimes navigates through latent spaces. So these are the kind of translated concepts. I'm going to play the trailer again because it's pretty short. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and redo it because I think I might be able to optimize. Oh no, I can't. Never mind. It's just going to be. It's going to be hopefully. AI is not a person, it's not a collaborator, it's a tool that we use. And then I was trying to hold that together with the idea that AI is an entity, so it's something that has to be respected and collaborated with. And that was kind of supported by the work of Kale Adam McDowell, and also to an extent the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence Project, which really, a lot of the writing pieces in this Indigenous Protocol really treated AI as like a sentient collaborator, which marries with some of my understanding, at least of Indigenous worldview around sentience and entityhood in other objects that as a Western society we might not consider. So I'm trying to like hold these two things simultaneously and I think it's both can be generative. Like it can be nice to use AI as a tool, and it can also be nice, like when I was writing, to use it to respect it as a collaborator and try to think about processes where it really becomes a collaborator. And finally, hopefully really hoping somebody knows the source of this, because I basically read something on Twitter that really was great a long time ago, and it stuck with me, but I can't find it for the life of me. So this was 3 steps for originality in the field of AI. So how to make original art, kind of how not to make art just by pushing a button, which I think most of us who make AI art know, like, we're definitely not just pushing a button. There's so much more to crafting AI art. But this person on Twitter, whose name I don't remember, said there were 3 things we could do to kind of make our AI art more original, which is 1, use AI in different contexts, original contexts or pipelines. So really put the AI tools into your own pipeline. Like in my case, the roller coaster simulator goes through a video, then gets interpreted by the AI and gets layered with more roller coasters and blah, blah, blah. And in the end, that becomes, of course, we can tell it's AI, we can often tell which notebook it is, but it's not like as jarring as just seeing like another fantasy landscape AI generated thing. Like it still becomes a little bit more original. The second way is to train models using original or unique data. So making sure that we're training using things that are either our own or that other people haven't used before. And I'm really always trying to think about ethics with training. So for me, it was important to like use Wikipedia, for example, which is open source, the images, or use my own data. And then the final thing that this person mentioned was to intervene into the code or to create code or modify code. And that's the thing that I would say I'm like a little bit lacking at. I'm not a super good coder, so I can't do so much of that, though I'm trying to work with other people and learn a bit of coding and see what I can do there. But I don't think I'm ever going to be the person like making the tools. But employing any or all of these, I think, will ensure that at least our art isn't just like a button push, even though it never is. But and more generally, I just wanted to say a few things that I learned over the last couple of years making these pieces. So one is like following artistic impulses and hunches, especially to do with those things that interest you deeply. So it's just like all of these pieces involve me going down what I call like research or learning wormholes, where I was like, right, I don't know why I need to figure this out, but I absolutely need to learn how to do X, Y, Z, and watch all these tutorials and try to do this coding that I don't understand, and eventually getting to some kind of understanding. And it really became an important part of my process to trust this like long form learning new art forms, going down wormholes and having the time to do that. And also exploring connections between different interests. So like trusting that this roller coaster and this music thing really would go together and finding all the resonances across them, and allowing that to then influence your practice as a whole. And I think I said something about doing like dragging electroacoustic music at one time, but like another term from drag that I really like is like feeling the full fantasy. So it's like really feel like the full fantasy of what I'm doing. So like if I'm gonna do roller coaster music, like really explore every possible aspect. Like I'm thinking about roller coasters and real music, or like having singers on a roller coaster, or like a live soundtrack for a roller coaster, or a motion simulator, or like all these different, it's like I really want to go there with what I'm doing. So these are like some of the things that I've learned over the last few years. And finally, just a little bit about, should I try doing this again, maybe? Yeah. I've just been chatting for ages. Where's Zoom? Okay. I'm kind of at the end anyway, but I will just try to the end. So what's next? This is just a little bit about the final, sort of what I'm doing next. So I'm working on a string quartet for Pietro Bazzini, which is going to explore more about pitch, intonation, tuning, gravity, and speed as concepts that are translated and resonate between each other. A project that's linking digital dance, avatars, motion capture with simulated roller coasters, and also augmented reality. I work for a chamber group that explores the texture of like a fan club or like fan culture, because that's something really important to roller coaster culture, is like fanism, fanness. And finally, unrelated, is a co-edited journal in Contemporary Music Review on the subject of Eliane Radigue, which I'm really excited about and is going to be coming out probably in a year's time or so. But yeah, those are all the things that are on the table. And finally, some time for questions. If anybody has it.
Who would like to kick off?
saw good vortices there, thinking this is a lot. That is a lot. There is a lot that is sort of influenced, as you said, by what's happening in the roller coaster. And I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned a few things. Like first, it's obviously always one piece of the roller coasters. One is because I watched them and how those two connect. And then you mentioned Sophie was just the incident that you felt like doing it. But how much of it is like piling up? But like, no, I think like this should be a new layer. And how much of it was when you started thinking about the piece, you thought, I want a large amount of parameters to be influenced by that, and I want this complexity, this sort of satirical.
That's a good question, and I think it changed for each section of the piece. Both the piece for the vocalist and the piece for Zubin, I worked in kind of short sections, so somehow that allowed me to explore, to have like tighter explorations of different kinds. So with Zubin's piece, it meant that, for example, the first section, it really isn't so complicated in the sense that there's only the layer of Holly Plus and Zubin with like a little bit of texture around it. So I was able to keep it kind of simpler. I knew that the second section I wanted to be like, as you say, like full stack. Like I wanted like tons of layers of hi-hats going at different tempi and like lots of 2 different sub basses and all these lines of like oscillating roller coaster synthesizers. And yeah, so I think I knew a little bit beforehand that I wanted the range of that. Like I wanted everything from something that was more simple, and it was kind of important for me to show the journey of like, the piece begins with Zubin just playing the left hand, then both hands come together, then it gets more complicated. Like I wanted to sort of show the journey of what, kind of how my explorations went a little bit. But I definitely knew beforehand that it was going to be a big piece somehow, and that there was going to be lots of layers. And I would say that's something I'm really trying to embrace with myself, because I would say previously to the roller coaster projects, I was really somebody who liked making pieces that did one thing for the whole piece. Now it's just like the piece. It's like, this is one process. Whereas the roller coaster pieces, I really want to like include all of my explorations. I want to like try lots of different things and make sure that the piece, I guess like for me, there's something about having it carry the same sense of, I mean, it can never be as thrilling as going on a real roller coaster, but carry some of that sense of like overwhelming thrillingness of a real roller coaster. Thanks. Please.
I'm very embarrassed myself because I'm not a musician, I'm a philosophy lecturer.
Oh, great.
Over the road. I was very, very interested by what you said, and particularly when you got us to watch the video before and after the explanation, and when you were talking about how the graphic realization of the score had to change because the pianist had to learn it, and it wasn't musically tangled, I guess. So I wanted to ask you about the idea of somebody being literate with translations or resonances, and how you think somebody can become literate in it. So do you think that it can be just repeated exposure to the sort of putting together of different dimensions of experience can allow somebody to perceive the kind of the resonances and translations between them? Do you think it needs to be theorized by the audience in order to see? Does it need to be scaffolded by explanations?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I think the first part of that answer comes from my relationship with a performer. So that's the first part of the kind of creation, and I think it is really important that both of us, as you say, sort of get trained in this idea of resonance. Like I don't think I could ever imagine making one of these pieces where I like hand a performer something and just say, okay, well, here's the piece, play the roller coaster piece. Like there's lots of exchange and dialogue and trying of different ideas and like, okay, what do you feel when that's playing? Okay, now do you perceive the roller coaster moving? And like this sort of working together. And also with both of the performers, like we talked a lot about roller coasters. It like became part of the experience. With Juliet, we went to a theme park together and like actually experienced the real, as part of our research, really experienced going on roller coasters together. So I think like for me and the performer, very important that we both come to this place. And for the audience, like it's really interesting. I think it's sort of idealized goal, of course, that like these pieces somehow carry some of that thrill of a real roller coaster ride, but it's also like impossible because a real roller coaster is such a physical experience that really wipes. When we went on this research trip to a theme park, it really like riding a roller coaster. You can do very little thinking. It's like an erasure. So in a way, I guess more related to the first question, it's like thinking about lots of layers. And I think what's not conveyed in that the video of the second piece is that there's of course the piano player, the video, and then there's two massive subwoofers that are both pulsing out these kind of things that you're feeling, and there's also two strobe lights that are really like flashing. So you're getting these like rhythms, pulses, and I really wanted to bring, as you say, kind of bring those resonances. I'm not sure if I think the scaffolding in the way that like there are roller coasters in the video, the audience kind of knows that it's about roller coasters, they're there, but I'm always looking for ways to kind of bring more of those resonances into the experience. But even, I guess saying that, there's also parts that I'm like really not bringing in. Going to the theme park, one of the things that I notice is like there's like a real tackiness to the experience, this like cheesy music in a box, like fair smells and all this sort of stuff. And there's like, for some reason, that layer isn't so much what I'm interested in. It's like more this like speed machine, like, and in a way it's like maybe thinking about my own idealized version of a theme park where there isn't so many other people and it's like, I'm just going on the rides for the sensations, like, but I think that's why I'm also, not forcing myself, but why I'm really excited to explore fan culture and the idea of fan clubs and things like that in relation to the roller coaster experience. So I'm going to be working with an ensemble and an audience actually in building this fan club for an existing roller coaster that exists in real life, and then bringing those experiences and fan objects, fanfics, fan videos, and things into like a performance. So yeah, I'm always trying to think about other different ways of bringing that resonance, but there's always more ways. Does that answer your question? Thanks for, great question.
Perhaps not central, but I wonder why you chose Rebel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a series of pieces that I've made that use beginnings of existing music, essentially. So like the first 3 seconds of existing pieces. I don't know why I find them really fascinating, especially by like ambiguously possibly queer composers. So as a queer person myself, I find it really interesting to look into the past. Often there's just like rumored accounts of whether this person may or may not have had a certain sexuality that may not have even existed at the time. The idea of queerness could not have existed. And so there's something about the Ravel left-hand concerto that already felt queer in a way, like this sort of one-handed wonder thing. And it had been rattling around in the back of my brain for a while. And I remember thinking, I saw Zubin perform once and was just thinking like, I have to do a Ravel piece. I don't know why, I just have to do this like Ravel thing. And I did some really early experiments in 2019, attaching different Ravel things to roller coasters that never sort of became anything. And I also saw an art piece by, the name's gonna escape me, I think Henry Sala, but I have to look that up. And they have a piece, they have 2 pieces, one called Ravel, which is 2 people playing the left-hand concerto on video, and you sort of hear the different rubato that these 2 performers take, and they kind of come in and out of alignment. And there was also a piece called Unravel, which has a person at a turntables mixing 2 different recordings of the Ravel left-hand concerto and trying to sync them up, even though they're different conductors. So actually those fed into this piece in a way, because I had these 2 accounts of Ravel being played twice at once with kind of fluctuating tempi, and that sort of generated some of the idea for using Ravel in this piece. But yeah, it's part of a sort of scope of pieces where I've used like Barber, Saint-Saëns, Ravel, some of those.
It's really interesting. Thanks. Got to be isn't there what
Yeah, it reminded me actually some of the, well, because I've taken software for prison, the landscapes that we generate, graphs, which are actually training, values and crafts, multi-dimensional graphs, landscapes, multi-dimensional.
I have thought about it, but actually in relation to graphing. So I'm working with a cognitive scientist who's exploring systems change, particularly in jazz music, looking at how he's sort of looking at what happens when jazz musicians change from one musical state to another, and exploring the kind of I guess the dimensional space in between two of these musical modes. And we've been exploring the idea of making this sort of graph roller coaster that takes you through different kind of latent spaces between these two different musical modes. So yeah, I'm thinking about it as like an actual graphic representation as well, which of course the interesting thing about that is always that in my roller coaster simulator, you always have gravity at play. So you've got this force that's like driving this in a certain way, which in one way is limiting, but also kind of gives it this unique movement and texture. Also, questions? Yeah. Oh, great.
I was wondering about, as you mentioned, the collaboration with software engineer or creative, and where you think this might be different going forward. Do you think you're going to want to some coding so you can get into that kind of things? Do you think you're going to work with collaborators? How do you see that developing?
The answer is yes. Yeah, I think it's going to be a bit of both. I think I've always, going back to way back to the beginning of my music education in university, like I've always been taught that it was important to like learn as much as I can from scratch. Like for example, using Max MSP, like my teacher was very don't download any tools, learn to program absolutely everything from scratch, which was very dogmatic. And now later in life, I don't see as so useful, but at the time it was very useful to learn to make a synthesizer and this and that. So I feel like I'm in the kind of the same phase right now where it's important for me to try to pick up some basics, even if that just allows me to communicate better with somebody who does code. Or like in the case of this piece, I was able to kind of code along with my friend collaborator. So it was like, at least be with them in the space and be like, oh no, I think actually that, because a lot of coding, at least in this experience, was like, okay, this isn't working, let's Google it, let's see. And I was able to kind of participate in the same way. And even though I didn't always know like the syntax, I was sometimes able to pick up on. So it's like learning enough to be a good collaborator. Maybe, and make some small tools myself, I think, but yeah, I go back and forth. I don't know if I just don't know if I'm gonna pick up enough now, but I think it'll be some of both.
There's no sense in the fan culture this being quite open source work. And it needs tools that you're developing, they things that you're sharing, and they open source tools like this. Yes, it's a toolkit that's available. They kind of do all the
well, interestingly, the patch that Soundbrenner made, for example, that goes between No Limits Max and the watches, that because it was commissioned through the Cyborg Soloist project, is part of the data of the Cyborg Soloist project, so it will be released online, which is a very interesting sort of confrontational thing for me in a way, because it's like, I can't even imagine if somebody like used a roller coaster simulator as a musical instrument the way I like it. Kind of, I can't even when an artist uses roller coasters, I'm already like, wow, somebody else is doing this. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty niche, but yeah, some of the things for sure will be available. You're really being the devil on my shoulder here. Yeah, in some ways, I think I would be. I don't know how I would feel if somebody did something really similar. Probably surprised, because it is kind of niche, but I really enjoy when I find art to add to this roller coaster art list. For example, I'm always kind of overjoyed when I find a new piece of roller coaster art. Yeah, so some of the tools will be out there. I'm not sure how useful. I don't know, maybe I have to, I haven't thought about it so much. I know that the sort of tool of Zubin's project will be put out there, so that'll be the first experience of like, right, this is going to be out in the world, and maybe somebody will pick it up and start linking these two programs that I use. Good question, tough question.
Do you have any more questions? Inevitably, the conversation will no doubt continue about if you those us. that case, Luke, thank you so much for visiting us. It's an amazing tool. It's really appreciated.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.